Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we aren't chasing ghosts, we're tracking shadows. You probably imagine medieval Japan as a place of honourable samurai duels, flash of steel drama and clean-cut justice. But let me tell you, long before the katana became the symbol of death, poison was the weapon of choice, and the battlefield was a silken room scented with incense and fear. You're not trudging through a muddy rice field right now. You're standing in the late Heian period, 794 to 1185 CE, a time when Japan's capital, Kyoto, then called Heian-kyo, was a glittering cage for its elite. You feel the chill of the Shinden-zukuri architecture around you, sweeping roofs, polished wooden floors, paper screens, shoji, that offer no privacy, only silhouettes. Every cough is heard, every whisper travels. You inhale the faint, sweet scent of plum blossoms, which, ironically, often mask the metallic tang of something far less pleasant. You see the court nobles, the kuge, draped in layers of silk, their faces painted white, their manners exquisitely formal, even when they're smiling at the man they just paid to disappear. These aren't the warriors who define later eras. These are poets, musicians and calligraphers, and some of the most subtle, effective and cowardly murderers in Japanese history. Their power lay not in the strength of their arms, but in the depth of their family connections and, crucially, their proximity to the emperor, who was less a ruler and more a highly revered semi-divine puppet. This is a game of political chess played with human lives, and the stakes are impossibly high. You probably won't survive this world. Not because a samurai will cut you down, but because the rice ball you just accepted might contain a dose of refined arsenic, or the elegant scroll you touched could be dusted with a slow-acting toxin. In the Heian court, the ultimate power was held by the Fujiwara clan, who mastered the art of regency government. They didn't need to overthrow the emperor, they just needed to ensure that every emperor was either a child, a recluse, or a puppet married to a Fujiwara daughter, whose son naturally would be the next emperor. This required a remarkable amount of quiet maintenance. If an imperial consort started getting too ambitious, or if a promising young prince showed signs of independent thought, well, accidents happen. A sudden fever, a persistent cough, a bad batch of seasonal mushrooms. The causes of death were always frustratingly natural, even when you knew better. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what's the local time? Knowing the reach of these shadows is always fascinating. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The entire apparatus of the Heian government was designed to maintain this delicate, high-stakes balance. But when the balance tipped, the tools of correction were rarely blunt. The court's preferred method was the silent elimination of a rival. This quiet removal had two major benefits. First, it maintained the illusion of imperial sanctity and courtly refinement. You can't look cultured if you're openly chopping off heads in the palace courtyard. Second, and more practically, it avoided attracting the attention of vengeful spirits, onryo. The Japanese belief system held that a person murdered violently was far more likely to return as a malevolent ghost, haunting the living and causing plagues, famine, or earthquakes. A quiet, ambiguous death, however, suggested a natural passing, keeping the vengeful spirits and the human political enemies guessing and relatively quiescent. It's the original keep your enemies close, but also mysteriously deceased. This era gives us the mainstream historical fact of the system of cloistered rule, insei, which arose to combat the Fujiwara's control. Retired emperors, having nominally abdicated, would continue to rule from behind the scenes, using the religious weight of their retired status to exert influence, and sometimes sideline the Fujiwara regents. You can imagine the resulting tension. A retired emperor, ostensibly a monk still holding the strings, and the Fujiwara family watching his every move. This created layers upon layers of intrigue. When a powerful cloistered emperor like Go Shirakawa held the reins, and he did for decades, outlasting rivals and sons alike, the political knives were certainly busy. His longevity was, in itself, a testament to his ruthlessness and ability to navigate this treacherous landscape. Now, for a quirky tidbit about this time, the court had an almost obsessive fear of pollution and impurity, which ironically aided the poisoners. Any contact with death, blood, or illness was considered spiritually contaminating and required lengthy purification rituals. If you were a noble, The absolute last thing you wanted to do was get involved in investigating a messy murder scene. That was for the low-class, impure workers. A sudden, quiet death, therefore, was a double win for the assassin. The rival was gone, and the court's fastidious nature ensured that the death would be quickly certified as natural causes, and the body disposed of with minimal low-rank investigation to avoid spiritual pollution. They were essentially too clean to catch a killer. One of the most effective tools in the Heian-era assassination kit was the use of curses and black magic. While we might view this as folklore today, for the Heian nobility it was a practical tool of murder. You wouldn't kill someone yourself. You would hire a sorcerer or a Buddhist monk, or even a rival family's spiritual advisor, to chant the appropriate sutras or write the correct curse paper to bring down divine wrath or demonic illness upon your enemy. This wasn't just superstitious fluff. It was a deeply held belief system that was weaponized. The victim, knowing he was cursed, would often sicken and die from sheer mental stress, creating a perfect psychosomatic murder. The assassin didn't even have to risk handling the poison. The ultimate deniability, right? It wasn't me. It was the angry spirits. This leads us to the heart of a debate. Historians still argue whether the numerous documented sudden illnesses and unfortunate accidents among imperial relatives and high-ranking officials were truly just the result of poor Heian sanitation and endemic disease, or if they were largely politically motivated murders masked by plausible deniability. The consensus often leans toward a blend, but the frequency of timely demises strongly suggests a heavy political hand. When a sickly emperor or a troublesome prince drops dead right when a political opponent is about to make a move, you have to read the writing on the poisoned cup. The beauty of the Heian plot was that it was always done by proxies, a servant, a minor courtier, a jealous rival he thought he was promoting. No one's hands were ever actually stained with blood, only with the elaborate makeup necessary to survive court life. The Heian court, for all its perceived softness and effete aesthetic, was a viper's nest. You walk past a beautifully designed garden, and you see the perfect geometry, the calming pond, the meticulously placed rocks. But underneath that carefully raked gravel are the secrets of the aristocracy. The family members starved to death in remote compounds, the political enemies who never returned from a hunting trip, the emperors who were persuaded to retire to a monastery, only to meet an early grave there. The most dangerous person in the room wasn't the burly bodyguard standing by the door. It was the quiet, educated man holding the poetry brush, ready to compose an ode to the man whose passing he'd just orchestrated. The true horror of this era is how murder was fully integrated into the political process, becoming just another tool of statecraft performed with a chilling level of elegance and detachment. You may have expected the brutality of the samurai. You found the cold, calculating cruelty of the aristocrat. And that, my friend, is a much scarier way to start a journey. You can almost feel the ground shifting beneath those polished Heian floors, can't you? Remember that sophisticated perfume and poison world of the Fujiwara? Well, their elegance was about to be shattered by the thundering hooves of a new, rougher class. As the central government in Kyoto grew decadent, distracted by poetry contests and the endless subtle game of aristocratic backstabbing we just discussed, the real power started bleeding out to the provinces. That vacuum was quickly filled by men who could actually do things, namely ride, fight, and enforce justice with a piece of sharpened steel. This marks the rise of the warrior clans, the samurai, and a stark transition from the silent poisoner to the public executioner. You're leaving the gentle, if deadly gardens of the capital and moving out into the muddy, pragmatic world of the bushi. For centuries, the Fujiwara had cleverly excluded the warrior class from true political power, relegating them to positions of enforcement, guarding the capital, or managing distant estates. But when the great estates needed protection from bandits, or when rival nobles started fighting over land, who did they call? Not a poet, I assure you. They called the ancestors of the Taira and Minamoto clans, two great warrior families whose rivalries would soon drown Japan in blood. The shift wasn't sudden. It was a slow, creeping disease on the Heian court's centralized power. The warriors, often descended from minor imperial lines that had been pushed out of the court, developed a fiercely independent martial culture. They valued Budo, the martial way, loyalty, and above all, effective strength. They viewed the court nobles as weaklings, pampered, useless relics who smelled faintly of mothballs and bad decisions. The court, in turn, underestimated these men, thinking they were mere tools. That was their fatal error. When the old power structures began to collapse under the weight of their own corruption and inefficiency, the Taira and Minamoto stepped in, initially as hired muscle in the numerous squabbles known as the Hogan Rebellion, 1156, and the Heiji Rebellion, 1160. These were the first true, large-scale, bloody eruptions of samurai power in Kyoto itself. You can imagine the shock. One day, you're debating the perfect shade of green for a lady's sleeve. The next, your paper screens are being ripped apart by men in armour who don't care about your haiku. The crucial difference here is the method of elimination. Remember how the Heian nobles favoured the silent, deniable death to avoid vengeful spirits? The warriors embraced the public, violent purge. When they took control, they needed to send a clear message. We are the power now, and opposition will be met with overwhelming, undeniable force. Take the Taira clan, for instance, led by the charismatic and ruthless Taira no Kiyomori. After the Heiji Rebellion, Kiyomori gained unprecedented control. He didn't just quietly poison his enemies, he exiled them, confiscated their lands, and executed their leaders. This gives us our mainstream historical fact for this section. The Heiji Rebellion marked the true beginning of the samurai's dominance, culminating in the Taira clan's temporary control and Kiyomori's elevation to the highest ranks of court nobility. He managed to marry his daughter to the emperor and ruled essentially as a military dictator, proving that strength, not pedigree, was the new currency. Kiyomori's actions, however, created a massive pool of vengeful survivors. In a bizarre act of political miscalculation, Kiyomori spared the lives of a few key Minamoto figures, including the young Minamoto no Yoritomo and Minamoto no Yoshitsune. His advisors warned him that leaving the seeds of danger will bring calamity later, but he famously and foolishly ignored them, perhaps due to the pleas of his stepmother or an overestimation of his own power. This act of mercy on his part is the quirky or fringe tidbit of this period. It was a shocking lapse in the samurai code of total elimination, and it cost him and his entire clan everything. That small act of sentimental weakness allowed the Minamoto seed to survive. The eventual showdown between the Taira and the Minamoto, the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185, was nothing short of total war. You are now trudging alongside the Minamoto forces, or maybe watching from a safe distant hill. It's a campaign of relentless pursuit and bloody battles, a far cry from the subtle politicking in Kyoto. The murders here are massacres. When the Minamoto took control of an area, the local Taira supporters, the warriors, their families, even their retainers, were often exterminated. It was a scorched earth policy designed to erase the enemy from the map. The goal was to eliminate all potential rivals, their children, and anyone who might carry the grudge forward. The most famous and tragic act of self-destruction came at the very end. At the final naval battle of Dan-no-ura, 1185, the remaining Taira were cornered. Rather than face capture and a gruesome public execution, many of the Taira elite, including the grandmother of the young child Emperor Antoku, committed suicide by drowning in the sea. The image of the child emperor being carried to the waves is haunting, a final, dramatic, murder-sedden suicide that wiped the clan from power. The result of all this violence was the Minamoto victory, and with it the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate in 1192 by Minamoto no Yoritomo. This new government was explicitly military, headquartered far from the corrupting influence of Kyoto in Kamakura. Yoritomo, having seen firsthand the danger of sparing enemies, became a master of systematic elimination. His first victims were not the Taira, who were already mostly gone, but his own relatives. Yoritomo was incredibly paranoid, or perhaps just strategically pragmatic. He viewed any strong member of his own family as a potential usurper. He systematically turned on his own brothers and cousins, fearing their popularity and military prowess. His half-brother, the brilliant general Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the very man who had engineered the final decisive victories against the Taira, became his most famous target. Yoshitsune was hounded relentlessly across the country, eventually betrayed and cornered by an ally in the north. His death, officially a suicide after a final desperate stand, was widely understood to be an orchestrated political murder by Yoritomo. Yoritomo even sent Yoshitsune's preserved head back to Kamakura as proof of his death. This act of fratricide was a chilling signal to the new warrior government. Loyalty to the shogun transcended family ties, and everyone was expendable. It's one of the great historical tragedies, a murder that cemented the new military order. Historians still argue whether Yoritomo's ruthless purge of his own family was purely driven by paranoia and power lust, or if it was a necessary cold-blooded measure required to establish a strong, unified military state in an age of total chaos. Could the shogunate have survived if popular, independent-minded generals like Yoshitsune had been allowed to live? The debate hinges on whether Yoritomo was a political genius or a tyrannical murderer. Perhaps, in this age, the two were indistinguishable. The rise of the warrior clans brought a new style of official, institutional murder to Japan. It wasn't just poisoning a rival noble, it was the sanctioned elimination of entire bloodlines and political factions. The execution was now a public spectacle, a tool of deterrence, and the foundation of the new government's power. The samurai didn't care about placating vengeful spirits. They were the ones creating them, and they were confident that their steel could deal with any ghost that dared to materialize. You've stepped out of the elegant darkness of the Heian court and into the stark, bloody daylight of the Kamakura military regime. The murders are no longer whispers, they are shouts, and you feel the raw, visceral difference in the air. You've witnessed the Minamoto triumph, a victory built on the bones of the Taira and sealed with the blood of their own general, Yoshitsune. Now, as you stand in the new military capital of Kamakura, you're seeing the second, more chilling phase of warrior rule, the return to quiet, systematic, and often internal murder. Minamoto no Yoritomo may have founded the shogunate in 1192, establishing the framework for centuries of samurai government, but his immediate successors proved that holding power was infinitely more deadly than seizing it. The mainstream historical fact here is that after Yoritomo's death in 1199, the real power rapidly shifted from the shogun's line to the family of his widow, the Hojo clan. This transition wasn't a peaceful inheritance, it was a brutal, orchestrated purge. The Hojo were originally minor provincial samurai who gained immense status through Yoritomo's marriage to Hojo Masako. She, often called the Nun Shogun, and her father, Hojo Tokimasa, became the masters of the shogunate's political machinery, and more importantly its secret elimination squad. You're now watching the Hojo, from the shadows, turn the newly formed bureaucracy of the shogunate against the very Minamoto family it was designed to serve. They didn't need to fight pitched battles. They used the structure of the military government to frame, isolate, and eliminate anyone who could challenge their position as the shogunal regents, shikken. The role of the shikken was essentially to rule in the shogun's name, reducing the actual shogun to a ceremonial figurehead, much like the Heian emperors they had despised. The irony would be comedic if it weren't so murderous. The first target was Yoritomo's son, and the second shogun, Minamoto no Yorii. He showed signs of independent thinking, and tried to rule without the Hojo's guidance. This was, in the Hojo playbook, a capital offence. Yorii was stripped of his position, forced to retire, and exiled to a temple in Izu in 1203. The official narrative was illness or religious seclusion. The dark truth, however, is that he was assassinated the following year. While the specifics are lost to history, the widely accepted version is that Hojo agents strangled him in his bath or locked him in a small chamber and killed him there. The assassination was carefully staged to appear like a spontaneous, unfortunate act of a few overly zealous guards quickly dealt with, but the strings were clearly pulled by Tokimasa. The new message was clear: you can be the shogun, but if you attempt to actually rule, you will disappear. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this era lies in the Hojo's meticulous use of suicide coercion. While not always true, many official accounts of politically motivated murders were recorded as seppuku, ritual suicide, or even simple illness. Why? Because the warrior code was still solidifying. A samurai who committed seppuku maintained his honour, even if the choice was made at the point of an assassin's blade. More crucially for the Hojo, an honourable suicide prevented the victim's family from launching a credible vendetta. The deceased had chosen his own fate. By threatening the family, stripping the warrior of his rank, or simply making his life unbearable, the Hojo often engineered voluntary suicides. They had mastered the art of murder without bloodshed or dishonour. The perfect bureaucratic assassination. Take the case of Yoritomo's younger brother-in-law, Hatakeyama Shigeyasu. A popular and powerful warrior, he was targeted by a smear campaign orchestrated by Hojo Tokimasa. A rumor was spread that he was planning to revolt. When Shigeyasu tried to defend himself, Hojo troops were dispatched. He committed seppuku on the roadside, convinced that his only honourable path was to avoid bringing shame and further slaughter to his clan. His father, Hatakeyama Shigetada, rushed to Kamakura to protest his son's innocence, only to be intercepted and killed by Hojo forces under the pretext of quelling a rebellion. It was a perfectly executed political double murder, neatly wrapped in the guise of suppressing treason. The Hojo's technique was a terrifying blend of political manoeuvring and swift targeted violence. They didn't just kill the Minamoto, they executed anyone who showed too much influence or military power, regardless of their family. They used the power of the Mandakoro, administrative board, and the Monchujo, court of inquiry, to conduct investigations, issue official death sentences, or simply create the necessary political fiction to justify a hit. The killer was rarely a shadowy figure in the night. It was an official decree, an order passed down through a carefully vetted chain of command. This bureaucracy of death made them incredibly hard to stop. Historians still argue whether the early Hojo regents, particularly Tokimasa and his son Yoshitoki, were cynical, power-mad usurpers, or if they genuinely believed that the Minamoto line was too volatile and weak, and that only their strong, stable control could prevent the new shogunate from collapsing back into the chaos of the Genpei War. Were they murderers of opportunity or political saviours? The debate reflects the deep ambivalence in Japanese history toward the Shikken. They brought stability, but only after executing 2 shoguns and countless loyal retainers. You must decide whether the end justifies the terrifying means. The process of elimination continued with the 3rd shogun, Minamoto no Sanetomo, the last of Yoritomo's direct line. Sanetomo grew up steeped in court culture, alienated from the rough samurai of Kamakura, and openly preferred poetry and the arts to military matters. This made him both a poor ruler and an increasing liability to the Hojo, particularly to Yoshitoki. In 1219, at the age of 26, Sanetomo was assassinated on the stone steps of the Tsurugaoka Hachimangu Shrine, the heart of the shogunate's spiritual power, after a ceremony. The killer was his own nephew, Minamoto no Kugyo, Yori's son, who was disguised as a priest and had been harbouring a deep resentment for years after being forced into the priesthood. Kugyo immediately confessed his motive, revenge for his father's murder and a desire to take the shogunal title. However, the subsequent events reek of Hojo orchestration. Kugyo, having served his purpose by wiping out the last of Yoritomo's direct line, was himself immediately hunted down and killed by a Hojo loyalist, before he could be properly questioned or implicated the true puppet master. The murder was attributed to a madman's vengeance, and the Hojo were left to mourn the shogun they had secretly despised. With Sanetomo's death, the Minamoto line was officially extinct. The Hojo could now install an imperial prince as a puppet shogun, cementing their role as the true, unchallengeable rulers of Japan. They had, through careful internal murders, managed to seize total control without firing a shot in civil war. The Kamakura period, under Hojo rule, perfected the art of the inside job. You're watching the transition from the chaotic, passionate blood feuds of the Genpei War to the cold, rational, and completely deniable extermination of political opposition. It's a far more insidious form of murder, cloaked in bureaucracy and justified by the necessary pursuit of stability. You stand in the shadow of this new military regime, realizing that the greatest danger is no longer the man with a sword on the battlefield, but the man with a scroll and a title who can make you disappear from the historical record with a single, quiet decree. You've seen the Hojo regents consolidate their grip on power by eliminating their own, the Minamoto shogunal line. But what happens when the imperial court, the very source of their authority, tries to take that power back? You're about to witness the moment when the military government of Kamakura dared to commit political murder on a truly grand scale, turning their administrative efficiency toward the imperial aristocracy itself. The year is 1221, and the simmering resentment in Kyoto finally boils over. Remember how the retired emperors, the cloistered emperors, still held sway in Kyoto, a power structure called Insei. This system, a political invention to counter the Fujiwara, now faced its greatest challenge, the rise of the Kamakura shogunate. The retired Emperor Go-Toba was a brilliant, culturally refined man, but he was also deeply ambitious and furious at the arrogance of the distant samurai who had stripped the court of its practical authority. He viewed the Hojo regents as coarse, low-born thugs. This leads to our mainstream historical fact. The Jokyu War, or Jokyu Disturbance, of 1221 was the direct result of Emperor Go-Toba attempting to overthrow the Kamakura shogunate. Go-Toba issued a decree calling for the loyal provinces to rise up and destroy Hojo Yoshitoki, the ruling regent. He effectively declared the Hojo to be rebels against the throne. For centuries, the emperor's word was law. This was a direct lethal challenge to Kamakura's authority. The Hojo response, orchestrated by Hojo Masako, the Nun shogun, still a formidable force, and Hojo Yoshitoki was swift, unified, and utterly brutal. They immediately rallied their vassals, appealing not to the emperor's divine authority, but to the samurai's loyalty, promising rewards and appealing to the warrior's pride against the frivolous court. The Kamakura army, led by Masako's loyal generals, marched on Kyoto with overwhelming force. The fighting was brief and decisive. The court's hastily assembled forces, mostly minor provincial warriors and palace guards, were no match for the hardened veterans of Kamakura. The war itself was short, but the aftermath was a systematic, calculated purge that solidified the shogunate's dominance for the next century. This wasn't a battlefield slaughter. It was the political murder of an entire class of political opponents. You're now standing in the ruined streets of Kyoto, days after the Kamakura victory. The initial executions are focused on those who actively fought, but the real, lasting terror lies in the official actions taken against the imperial family itself. Go-Toba was stripped of his title and exiled to the remote Oki Islands, a political death sentence, as exile was often a prelude to a quick demise. His sons, the retired emperors Tsuchi Mikado and Juntoku, who were also implicated, were exiled to other distant, equally inhospitable locations. No emperor had been exiled so severely since ancient times. This act was the ultimate political murder, the spiritual killing of the emperor's power. Now, for the quirky or fringe tidbit, the Hojo forces not only executed the aristocratic leaders of the revolt, but also seized thousands of estates, the very foundation of the court nobility's wealth and influence. They distributed these confiscated lands to their own loyal samurai vassals, essentially buying their loyalty with the spoils of the purge. Furthermore, they instituted a new military governor, the Rokuhara Tandai, stationed in Kyoto itself. This office was dedicated solely to monitoring the imperial court and ensuring that the aristocracy never again posed a military or political threat. The Rokuhara Tandai was essentially a permanent occupation force and a secret police headquarters, making sure any new political opposition in Kyoto was killed in utero. The purge extended far beyond the battlefield participants. The Hojo were meticulous. They compiled lists of court nobles, officials, and even Buddhist monks who had supported Go-Toba. These people were rounded up, often without trial, and executed. The justification was always treason against the shogunate, which was quickly becoming the ultimate crime. The murders were public and brutal, designed to terrify the remaining aristocracy into complete compliance. Historians still argue whether the severity of the Hojo retaliation after the Jokyu War was a necessary step to establish the long period of stability that followed, or an act of opportunistic, unforgivable tyranny that permanently crippled the emperor's political role. On the one hand, their total victory prevented the nation from descending back into the chaotic feuds that plagued the late Heian period. On the other, the systematic destruction of the court's authority was a clear and brutal political assassination of a millennium-old system of governance. Was this state-building or merely high-stakes power-grabbing? The debate centres on the concept of necessary evil in state formation. The consequences of this purge were long-lasting. The shogunate, after this event, possessed the moral and practical authority to depose and replace emperors at will. The imperial court became less a source of power and more a source of legitimacy, whose incumbents were carefully monitored, controlled, and occasionally eliminated by the Rokuhara Tandai. If an emperor or a retired emperor showed a single hint of political ambition, a wrong letter, a poorly chosen advisor, the apparatus was already in place for their swift, silent removal. The fate of the exiled Go-Toba and his sons served as a chilling, constant reminder. The Hojo's innovation in murder was institutionalization. They created a permanent structure, the Rokuhara Tandai, whose entire function was to suppress opposition in the capital through surveillance, intimidation, and targeted assassination. You might call them the first true state-sanctioned secret killers of the warrior age. They controlled the roads, they screened all visitors to the capital, and they maintained a vast network of spies, Metzge, who listened to every whisper. It was a chilling blend of the old Heian paranoia and the new warrior brutality. Where the Heian court used poison and curses to avoid Onryo, the Hojo used overwhelming military force and public execution to create political terror, and then used the apparatus of the Rokuhara Tandai to ensure that the source of that terror was never traced back to the regent's personal hands. The Shikan ruled from Kamakura, but their shadow of murder stretched across the land all the way to the heart of Kyoto. So you're standing in a Japan where the ruling class is not only willing to murder, but to systematically exterminate an entire opposing political system. The quiet, elegant poisonings are replaced by the grim, efficient purges. The court nobles, those lovers of poetry, now know that their silks offer no protection from the samurai's blade, and their divine lineage is irrelevant to the pragmatic executioners sent from Kamakura. The lesson of the Yokyu War, enforced by the post-war massacre, is absolute. In this new Japan, power flows from the sword, and defiance is met with the complete and total erasure of the defiant. The killers have moved out of the back alleys and into the halls of government, making murder an act of state policy. You've witnessed the murderers shift from the veiled poisoners of the Heian court to the institutional executioners of the Kamakura shogunate. Now let's talk about the shadows they hired, the people whose names became synonymous with clandestine murder. The ninja. Forget the black hooded figures you see in movies, flying across rooftops with smoke bombs. The reality of the early shinobi, the term they used for themselves, was far less dramatic, much dirtier, and intrinsically tied to the political assassinations of the medieval period. You are now stepping into the rugged, remote borderlands of the provinces, particularly Iga and Koka, the mountainous regions that provided a safe haven for these groups. The people here were not initially a unified, organised guild of assassins. They were, in our mainstream historical fact, localised groups of independent warriors, spies, and specialised irregulars who developed skills necessary for survival in a fragmented political landscape. Their techniques were born out of necessity: guerrilla warfare, reconnaissance, and critically infiltration and intelligence, gathering for the provincial lords, daimyo, who were constantly vying for power. Their murder was a service, a specialised task, and often the last resort. The most valuable service the early shinobi offered wasn't killing a lord, it was espionage. They were masters of disguise, using their local knowledge to blend into the population. As travelling priests, merchants, actors, or even ordinary farmers. They didn't wear dramatic black costumes, they wore the practical, muted colours of the working class. Their goal was to survive long enough to gather the crucial intelligence, troop movements, food stores, internal dissension, that would allow their patron daimyo to win a war without fighting. However, when intelligence wasn't enough, assassination was their tool. Their methods were subtle, borrowing from the Heian-era preference for deniability. They weren't interested in a messy sword fight. They favoured arson, sabotage, and poison, techniques that made a political rival's death look like an accident or the result of a rival's treachery. You're watching a shinobi now, maybe an operative of the Koka region, moving through the night. He isn't carrying a heavy katana, he's carrying a small sharp blade called a kunai, a simple farm tool repurposed as a weapon, or perhaps a small pouch containing fast-acting powder derived from local plants. The unique thing about the shinobi's brand of murder, our quirky or fringe tidbit, is their use of psychological warfare and what they called nindo, or the way of endurance. The early ninja were masters of creating an atmosphere of paranoia around their target. They would infiltrate a compound not to kill the lord immediately, but to leave subtle, terrifying signs. A misplaced object, a strange scratching sound, a small coded message in the lord's chambers. This slow-burn psychological terror often drove the target's guards to distraction, or forced the lord into a nervous breakdown, making the final strike easier, or, as often happened, convincing the lord's own paranoid retainers to turn on him, eliminating the shinobi's need to act at all. It was a terrifying form of manipulation that led to the victim's demise. Historians still argue whether the extreme secrecy and seemingly fantastical abilities attributed to the ninja were genuine military techniques, or a highly successful form of deliberate disinformation and propaganda spread by the clans themselves. Did they really use fire breath and water walking techniques? Of course not literally. But by cultivating a reputation for near supernatural ability, by claiming they were untouchable ghosts, they terrorized their targets more effectively than any army. This debate centers on the concept of asymmetric warfare. The ninjas' greatest weapon was arguably their reputation, a myth manufactured to instill paralyzing fear. The most sought-after mission for an early shinobi was the sleeping body mission, the ultimate assassination. This involved getting past layers of security to kill a highly protected lord in his bed, without making a sound or leaving a trace. A favourite technique was to use a thin, specially designed saw or file to cut a small hole in the floorboards directly under the target's futon. Through this tiny hole, a specialised blowpipe or a thin poison needle could be inserted, delivering the lethal dose while the lord slept soundly. The floorboards were replaced, the hole sealed, and the shinobi vanished. The next morning the lord was found dead, with no obvious cause, and the death was inevitably attributed to a sudden illness. The perfect echo of the old Heian style, but executed with warrior efficiency. As the Kamakura shogunate gave way to internal power struggles and the eventual chaos of the Muromachi period, the demand for these secret killers skyrocketed. The shinobi became indispensable. They weren't just killing the shogun's enemies, they were being hired to kill one another's clients in a complex web of betrayal. They acted as mercenaries of murder, loyal only to the highest bidder or the most reliable contract. This lack of centralized allegiance is why they were so often both feared and despised by the conventional samurai. A samurai's honor was based on their open loyalty and battlefield conduct. The shinobi's method was deception and hidden violence. The relationship between the established power structure and the ninja was deeply ambivalent. They were absolutely necessary for the dirty work of political murder, yet they were never truly trusted. This is a common pattern in history. Those who wield the dirtiest weapons are rarely invited to sit at the high table. They were the ones who could eliminate a troublesome family member or a rebellious vassal without the lord's hands ever being stained, maintaining the official facade of honor. The ninja was the ultimate deniable asset, the historical equivalent of plausible political murder. You are seeing the crucial point in the evolution of medieval Japanese murder, the institutionalization of the contract kill. The court nobles poisoned their rivals internally, the Hojo purged their enemies bureaucratically, and now the provincial lords are outsourcing their high-risk assassinations to these specialists. This proliferation of deadly expertise meant that nowhere in Japan, not even the shogun's bedchamber, was truly safe. The rise of the shinobi made murder a reliable, professionalized service, ensuring that the next centuries of Japanese history would be punctuated by the sudden, unexplained deaths of key figures. The shadows are getting thicker, and they now have a price tag. You've seen the Kamakura shogunate, built on the murders of the Minamoto, stabilized by the Hojo purges, and protected by the hired shadows of the shinobi. But no structure built on betrayal can last forever. We now enter a period of prolonged chaos and political murder known as the Muromachi period, 1336 to 1573, ushered in by one of the most famous acts of calculated treachery in Japanese history, the rise of the Ashikaga clan. This chapter is about how murder didn't just sustain a government, it became the very foundation upon which a new line of shoguns rose and repeatedly fractured. The story begins with the Emperor Go-Daigo, who, furious after decades of Hojo control, finally rebelled and temporarily restored direct imperial rule, the Kenmu Restoration. To achieve this, he had to enlist the help of the most powerful warrior clans in the country, including the Ashikaga. Ashikaga Takauji, initially a Hojo loyalist, was sent to suppress Go-Daigo's rebellion, but in a monumental act of career-defining betrayal, switched sides and attacked the Hojo headquarters in Kyoto. This act, our mainstream historical fact, shattered the Hojo's grip on power and ultimately led to the fall of the Kamakura shogunate in 1333. Takauji was hailed as a hero, but his true ambition was not to restore the emperor's power, it was to become the next military ruler. Go-Daigo quickly realized that he had merely exchanged one powerful overlord, the Hojo, for a far more ruthless one, Takauji. When Go-Daigo resisted Takauji's attempts to establish a new shogunate, Takauji rebelled against the emperor he had just helped enthrone, driving Go-Daigo out of Kyoto and installing a rival emperor. This schism created the northern and southern courts, Nambokusho, plunging Japan into 50 years of civil war where both sides claimed divine legitimacy, a perfect cover for endless sanctioned murder. Takauji's rise was a masterclass in politically motivated murder and the ruthless elimination of allies. He needed to clear the political board, and his own family provided the first victims. The structure of the new Ashikaga shogunate was built on shaky familial loyalty, which quickly devolved into fratricide. Takauji's younger brother, Ashikaga Tadayoshi, had been his co-ruler, responsible for the shogunate's administrative machinery in Kyoto, while Takauji handled the military side. They were the perfect partnership, until they weren't. Their relationship curdled into an open power struggle, known as the Kano Disturbance, 1350 to 1352. This period of fighting was not an external war. It was a devastating internal family feud. Tadayoshi, the more politically astute brother, opposed Takauji's increasingly autocratic style and his reliance on certain military governors, shugo. The conflict saw them fighting each other, switching allegiance between the northern and southern imperial courts and tearing the Ashikaga structure apart. Here's the quirky or fringe tidbit. When Takauji finally defeated his brother Tadayoshi in 1352, Tadayoshi was imprisoned in a temple in Kamakura. Shortly thereafter, he died suddenly. Officially, it was illness, a common ailment that conveniently carried off political rivals. Unofficially, and widely believed at the time, Tadayoshi was poisoned by his own brother, Takauji, or his agents. This death, shrouded in plausible deniability, became a template for Ashikaga governance. Eliminate your closest threat, even if it's your own flesh and blood, but ensure the death is recorded as natural or ritual suicide. This kept the circle of vengeance slightly smaller than a public execution would have provoked. The poisoner's hand had returned, but with a new twist. It was now deployed by the shogun himself to control his own bloodline. The murder of Tadayoshi was a chilling lesson for all future Ashikaga shoguns. The most dangerous threat is often the man sharing your ancestral surname. The internal violence didn't stop there. The Ashikaga shogunate, known as the Muromachi shogunate, suffered from endemic succession crises marked by violence. Shogun after shogun had to deal with rebellions from their own family members, or from powerful deputy shoguns, kanrei. The shogunate rarely enjoyed the long periods of stability that the Hojo had managed because the principle of betrayal was woven into its founding myth. If the shogun could betray the emperor, and a brother could betray a brother, then anyone could betray anyone. Historians still argue whether the endemic, violent succession struggles of the Ashikaga shogunate were the inevitable consequence of its treacherous founding, a kind of karmic political debt, or if it simply reflected the general power decentralization and chaos of the period, where any lord with power could logically challenge the central authority. Was it a specific Ashikaga curse, or a general feature of late medieval Japan? The ongoing debate reflects the inherent instability of a regime born not of stable consensus, but of spectacular, bloody opportunism. The most powerful families who served the Ashikaga, like the Hosokawa and the Hatakeyama, also adopted this culture of fratricide and political murder. They saw how the shogun himself operated, and they mirrored his ruthlessness. For example, succession within the Hosokawa clan often involved one brother killing another, or a nephew eliminating an uncle to seize the powerful kanrei position, leading to smaller, localized, but no less brutal purges. Assassination was normalized as a legitimate, even expected tool of career advancement. You're watching an entire political system that not only tolerates murder, but actively encourages it at the highest levels. When the Ashikaga shoguns did manage to solidify power, they often became patrons of the arts and culture, building the Kinkaku-ji, Golden Pavilion for instance, but their refinement masked a chilling ruthlessness. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun, is our exemplar of this duality. He brought an end to the northern and southern court split, effectively reunifying the imperial line, but he did so by isolating and politically destroying all rivals, often through murder veiled as political retirement or sudden illness. His court was a high watermark of culture, but its foundation was a mountain of strategically eliminated enemies. You walk through the streets of Kyoto under the Ashikaga, you see the rise of the daimyo and the decline of central authority. The shogun in Kyoto is increasingly just the most prominent of many killers. As the central power weakens, the provincial lords take the lessons of betrayal and murder back to their own domains, setting the stage for the greatest period of murder and warfare yet to come, the Sengoku, or Warring States period. The Ashikaga regime, founded on the murder of the Hojo and its own brother, was destined to be consumed by the same violence it institutionalized. You've traced the bloody lineage of the Ashikaga shogunate, a house built on fratricide and political expediency. But all the localized murders and internal feuds we've discussed, the poisoned cups, the forced suicides, were merely preludes to the great national hemorrhage that was the Onin War, 1467 to 1477. This decade-long conflict wasn't just a battle. It was the political murder of the entire central government structure, and it turned the elegant capital of Kyoto into a burnt-out shell, normalizing casual, widespread slaughter. You're no longer observing from the shadows. You're caught in the swirling, terrifying reality of a capital city that has become a perpetual battleground. This war began, ironically, as a dispute over the succession of the shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, a man who cared more for tea ceremonies and art than he did for governance. The shogun's lack of firm decision-making allowed two immensely powerful daimyo, Hosokawa Katsumoto and Yamana Sozen, to back rival heirs. This complex dispute over who would be the next shogun, combined with a myriad of older land disputes and personal vendettas, exploded into a total civil war that fractured the entire nation. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Onin War marked the definitive end of the Ashikaga shogunate's effective central control and the beginning of the Sengoku, or Warring States period. Even though the shogunate technically lasted for another century, from this point forward, the shogun was little more than a powerless figurehead, constantly manipulated or ignored by the powerful provincial warlords, daimyo. The war didn't just kill people, it killed the political concept of a unified Japan ruled from Kyoto. The horror of the Onin War was its location. The two main rival armies, the eastern, Hosokawa, and the western, Yamana, encamped in Kyoto itself, dividing the capital and engaging in a constant decade-long urban warfare. You would witness battles breaking out in the streets outside the imperial palace, the shogun's residence, and even the sacred temples. Imagine a major world capital today, abandoned and used as a permanent military base, where every street corner is a potential ambush. The soldiers weren't fighting for grand ideals, they were fighting for the supremacy of their respective clan heads, and the lines between soldier, bandit, and casual murderer quickly blurred. This constant state of violence led to the most appalling forms of murder. It wasn't about political rivals disappearing anymore, it was about the destruction of infrastructure and the complete disregard for civilian life. Widespread arson was a major tool of warfare used to dislodge entrenched enemy positions. The result was that most of the city's great temples, shrines, and, critically, the houses of the aristocracy were systematically burned. When the armies withdrew in 1477, Kyoto was a wasteland. The population had fled, the cultural treasures were destroyed, and the central institutions of governance, including the imperial court and the shogunate, were financially ruined and politically irrelevant. For the quirky or fringe tidbit of this era, consider the fate of the Kyotokugi court nobles. Remember the refined poisoners of the Heian era? They were now penniless refugees. Many Kug were forced to abandon their ancestral homes and flee to distant provinces, relying on the charity of local daimyo for their survival. These great cultural figures, who once commanded armies with a whisper, were now essentially beggars. They were murdered not by a quick blade, but by political and economic collapse. Their lineage survived, but their political power and status were assassinated by the sheer scale of the chaos. It's a sad, quiet murder of high culture. The most profound impact of the Onin War was the concept of Gekkokujo, literally Luska, low overcomes high, which became the guiding principle of the next century. The warriors saw the central government collapse and realized that all traditional authority was a sham. If the shogun couldn't even control his own capital, then why should a provincial vassal obey him? Gekkokujo was the spirit of murder institutionalized at every level of society. It justified a vassal betraying his lord, a son killing his father, or a retainer usurping his daimyo. Murder wasn't a crime, it was a pathway to advancement. Historians still argue whether the Onin War, for all its destructive chaos, was a necessary fire that cleansed the old, corrupt feudal order and prepared Japan for eventual reunification under the Great Unifiers. Was this decade of continuous anarchic murder a prerequisite for the strong, centralised governance that would eventually emerge, or was it a pointless, self-inflicted wound that merely postponed true progress? The debate reflects the challenge of finding meaning in the senseless, protracted slaughter of a civil war, where political lines blurred into simple greed and opportunism. The key lesson of the Onin War's carnage was the total devaluation of human life and political oaths. A contract signed one day could be nullified by an assassination the next. The killers were no longer just the Hojo secret police or the contracted shinobi. They were every soldier, every peasant-turned-bandit, and every ambitious retainer. The murder rate skyrocketed, and the concept of an honourable death was largely replaced by the pragmatic reality of a quick, often anonymous, end in a burning street or a skirmish for a grain store. The political murder of the Ashikaga family continued, of course, but it hardly mattered anymore. The shogun's power was so diminished that killing him was often more trouble than it was worth. The focus of murder moved to the provinces, where local daimyo had to kill and purge their own domains to survive. The Onin War essentially issued a national hunting license, replacing the central control of the shogunate with thousands of localized brutal power struggles, all fueled by the logic that the strong survives and the weak must be eliminated. You're now standing on the precipice of the true warring states period, where every man's ambition is a dagger and every political agreement is written in sand. The stage is set for the rise of the next generation of great murderers. You are now fully immersed in the era of Gekkokujo, where the anarchy birthed by the Onin War has metastasized across Japan. The shogun in Kyoto is a ghost, and the provincial lords, daimyo, are locked in a perpetual struggle for land and survival. In this environment, political murder shifts again. It becomes a high-profile, brazen act of military opportunism designed to send shockwaves across the country. The era needed a catalyst, a landmark crime that would signal the complete and total collapse of the old order. That catalyst was the assassination of the shogun Ashikaga Yoshiteru in 1565. You're watching the last moment of true dignity and spectacular violence of the Ashikaga line. Yoshiteru was the 13th Ashikaga shogun, and unlike his feckless predecessors, who obsessed over tea and poetry, Yoshiteru was a genuinely ambitious martial leader. He saw the rot in the shogunate and actively tried to restore its prestige and central authority. He achieved this through diplomacy, securing alliances with powerful daimyo like Wasugi Kenshin and Takeda Shingen, and through an attempt to reconcile the warring factions within Kyoto. He wasn't just a figurehead, he was a potential threat to anyone who preferred the chaos of the Sengoku period. This made him a prime target for the very people who were supposed to protect him, his own vassals. The chief architect of his downfall was the ambitious, powerful warlord Miyoshi Nagiyoshi and his retainers, specifically the infamous Miyoshi III, Miyoshi Triumvirate, and Matsunaga Hisahide. These men saw Yoshiteru's attempts at centralizing power as a direct threat to their local dominance in the vicinity of Kyoto. They decided that the shogun had to be eliminated, not just exiled or poisoned, but brutally executed to make way for a more pliable puppet. The mainstream historical fact here is the Eiraku Incident, 1565, which was the formalized attack on Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiteru's residence, the Nijo Palace, by the forces of the Miyoshi Triumvirate and Matsunaga Hisahide. This was not a subtle poisoning, it was a siege and a massacre, turning the shogun's home into a fortress under attack. Yoshiteru, knowing his time was up, prepared for his end with a final dramatic display of warrior valour. Our quirky or fringe tidbit is his method of preparation. As the enemy forces poured into the palace, he laid out his prized collection of famous swords, one by one, on a mat. As he fought, he would use one sword until its blade was broken or dulled, discard it, and pick up a fresh legendary blade to continue his defence. It was a defiant, flamboyant act of martial ritual, a warrior shogun meeting his political murder in a blaze of glory, killing scores of enemy soldiers before he was finally overwhelmed. This act cemented his reputation as the sword shogun, and gave him a legacy of heroism that stood in sharp contrast to the treachery that killed him. Hisahide and the Miyoshi were not just killing the shogun, they were committing the political murder of the entire shogunate's remaining legitimacy. By staging such a brazen public assassination, they signalled to all of Japan that the old bonds of loyalty were meaningless, They then immediately installed Yoshiteru's young cousin, Ashikaga Yoshihide, as the new shogun, a puppet who was quickly murdered or deposed shortly after. The true power belonged to the Miyoshi/Matsunaga cabal. This assassination, and the subsequent puppet shogun debacle, brought about a crucial shift in the nature of murder in the Sengoku period. Before, murders were often about gaining control of an existing functional political office, like the Hojo killing the Minamoto shoguns. Now, the murder was purely about securing regional military power. The shogun's title was just a temporary convenience, a disposable prop. This was the pure, distilled essence of Gekkokujo, the vassal killing the ultimate lord, not to take his place, but to render the place worthless. Historians still argue whether Matsunaga Hisahide, who helped orchestrate the shogun's murder and later performed countless betrayals, including against his former masters, the Miyoshi, was a chaotic villain driven purely by self-interest, or a pragmatic political innovator who recognised that the old feudal system was dead and that only ruthless, flexible opportunism could survive the Sengoku period. He was a notorious arsonist, a connoisseur of the arts, and a serial traitor, a murderer who managed to perfectly embody the terrifying contradictions of the era. The debate concerns whether his acts were moral failures or political necessities. The fallout from the Oroku incident created a total power vacuum in the capital, making Kyoto ripe for invasion. It provided the perfect moral pretext for the warlord who would eventually unify Japan, Oda Nobunaga, to march on the capital in 1568. Nobunaga was ostensibly coming to avenge the assassinated shogun and install the surviving brother, Ashikaga Yoshiaki. But in reality he was using the murder as a cover for his own naked power grab. The murder of Yoshiteru was the signal that brought the greatest killer of the Sengoku period onto the national stage. The killers of the shogun, the Miyoshi triumvirate and Matsunaga Hisahide, quickly found that their victory was short-lived. Nobunaga's entry into Kyoto crushed their power. Hisahide, the man who helped kill the shogun, was forced into submission and became Nobunaga's vassal. The fate of the murderers in the Sengoku period was often to become the murdered themselves, or to suffer a slow political death under a new, even more ruthless master. You realise that in this time, there is no permanent safety for the traitor. The shogun's murder was a magnificent political opportunity, but it also painted a giant target on the backs of the men who committed it. They had proven that any lord could be killed, which meant they could be killed too. The Ashikaga line was finally extinguished for good, but the chaos it died in lived on, setting the stage for the next wave of localised, incessant murder and betrayal among the hundreds of petty lords now struggling to survive. You've seen the great centralised murders of the court and the shogunate. Now, as the Sengoku period rages, you're looking at murder at its most intimate, localised, and tragically frequent. We're talking about the tens, perhaps hundreds, of power struggles within the ruling families of the provincial warlords, the daimyo. With the Ashikaga shogun a phantom and the capital burned out, authority resided only in the strength of the local lord. The ultimate tool for seizing or retaining that local control was the elimination of any rival within your own family. This is the era where the saying, "the most dangerous place is between a daimyo's son and his inheritance," became a lethal reality. The vast majority of daimyo houses, from the mighty Takeda and Hojo to the lesser regional clans, experienced murderous internal succession disputes. Unlike the elaborate political machinations of Kyoto, these murders were often swift, brutal, and motivated by pure raw greed for the inheritance of the domain Han. The mainstream historical fact for this section is the ubiquitous nature of oi sodo, or family disturbances, which became a defining feature of the Sengoku period. These disturbances were often triggered by a daimyo dying without a clear heir, or by the daimyo choosing a younger favourite son over the eldest, who had the traditional right. These crises invariably involved murder, both direct and subtle, as various retainers and family factions manoeuvred to place their favoured candidate on the seat of power. If you were a child in a powerful daimyo family, you grew up knowing your life was forfeit if you lost a political game of musical chairs. Consider the Hojo of Odawara, a powerful daimyo clan in the Kanto region. Despite their external strength, their internal politics were vicious. The succession often required the elimination of rival brothers or nephews who posed a threat. These murders were rarely public. They were a quiet transaction carried out by trusted retainers in a remote compound, or returning to an old classic through a poisoned drink at a banquet. The official cause of death was invariably sudden illness. This brings us to our quirky or fringe tidbit. The refinement of the tea ceremony, Chanoyu, during the Sengoku period, though seemingly peaceful and aesthetic, became an ideal vector for murder. The ceremony's emphasis on quiet ritual, trusted service, and the intimate sharing of a single bowl of tea offered the perfect opportunity for the quick, deniable delivery of toxins. The preparation and serving were often done by the daimyo's most trusted inner circle, making the betrayal all the more effective. The enemy wasn't the man across the battlefield, it was the smiling, kneeling attendant handing you the exquisitely crafted tea bowl. The aesthetic tranquility of the ceremony provided the perfect cover for the ultimate act of malice. The weapon of choice was often poison, sometimes known as dokumori, poison serving, because it allowed the daimyo who ordered the murder to maintain a veneer of innocence and avoid open conflict with the victim's supporters. A public execution of a high-ranking family member could provoke a crippling civil war within the clan. A quiet death by illness, however, allowed the remaining family and retainers to quickly coalesce around the new, pre-selected heir, maintaining clan unity in the face of external enemies. Murder, in this context, was a cold, pragmatic tool for preserving the clan's external viability. The betrayal was often organised by a senior retainer, a karo, who was tired of the current lord's instability or incompetence and secretly backed a more pliable heir. These regicide by proxy murders ensured that the karo maintained enormous power over the new, often young daimyo. You're seeing the Gekokujo principle working its way down the power ladder, not just vassal against shogun, but retainer against daimyo. Historians still argue whether the extreme violence and treachery within daimyo families, the endemic fratricide and patricide, were primarily a result of the weakening of the central authority, shogun, which allowed local laws to lapse, or if it was an inevitable social consequence of the primogeniture system, inheritance by the eldest son, which often forced ambitious, talented younger sons into the dangerous position of either submission or elimination. The debate centres on whether the cause was political anarchy or deeply flawed inheritance customs. The murder of Imagawa Yoshimoto, a powerful daimyo whose assassination will be central to the next section, also had its roots in internal violence. Yoshimoto himself only became the daimyo after a brutal internal succession struggle, the Hanagura Rebellion, 1536, where he fought and eliminated his own brother. The fact that he was killed years later by an external force, Oda Nobunaga, only highlights the deadly truth. If you survived your own family's attempts to kill you, you then had to worry about every other daimyo trying to do the same. The overall environment created a terrifying atmosphere of paranoia. Daimyo compounds became fortresses of suspicion. Food was tested meticulously, guards were rotated constantly, and even a minor retainer who showed too much popularity could find himself suddenly transferred to a distant, dangerous post, or simply disappearing. You can imagine the tension. A lord at a banquet, looking at the elaborate spread, knowing that everyone around him is smiling, yet a single mistake could lead to his excruciating quiet death. This environment was the ultimate crucible for the eventual unifiers of Japan. Only the most ruthless, paranoid, and strategically murderous daimyo, men like Oda Nobunaga, could survive this internal bloodbath and then project that ruthlessness outward. The localized murders of the daimyo families were the training grounds for the national tyrants to come. You realize that to survive this era, you didn't just need a strong sword arm. You needed an iron will and an absolute willingness to commit, or condone, the murder of those closest to you. You've witnessed the widespread internal murderous chaos of the daimyo houses. Now that localized violence is about to be unified, centralized, and wielded with terrifying efficiency by the first of Japan's great unifiers, a man whose name is synonymous with political ruthlessness, Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga didn't just survive the Sengoku period's internal purges, he perfected them, turning murder from a tool of survival into a strategy for national conquest. You are now standing in the centre of the political storm, the mid-16th century, and the world is about to change very quickly. Nobunaga's career begins with a famous, audacious murder that defines his future. Remember Imagawa Yoshimoto from the last section, the powerful daimyo who had killed his own brother to seize control? In 1560, Yoshimoto marched on Nobunaga's small fledgling domain in Owari with a massive army, intending to conquer it on his way to Kyoto. Nobunaga, heavily outnumbered, executed a daring preemptive strike that is our mainstream historical fact, the Battle of Okahazama. Nobunaga's small force ambushed Yoshimoto's main camp in a sudden downpour, killing Yoshimoto himself. This was a battlefield murder, a decapitation strike that instantly dissolved the massive Imagawa army and vaulted Nobunaga from a minor local lord to a national player. This single high-stakes assassination bought him the time and reputation necessary to start his unification campaign. Nobunaga's methods of political elimination were varied, but they all shared a distinct lack of sentimentality or adherence to traditional samurai codes. He was a radical pragmatist who used terror as a systemic tool of governance. When he entered Kyoto in 1568, ostensibly to install the puppet Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiaki, remember the murdered Yoshiteru's brother, he quickly realized the new shogun wanted to actually rule. Nobunaga handled this not with a formal war, but with a slow, grinding political strangulation, eventually exiling Yoshiaki in 1573, thus committing the final effective murder of the Ashikaga shogunate after over 230 years. The shogunate died not in battle, but in a whimper of exile, utterly irrelevant to the new power structure. Nobunaga's most infamous and sweeping act of sanctioned murder was against his religious enemies. The Buddhist monasteries, particularly the massive fortified compounds of the Tendai sect on Mount Hiei, near Kyoto, had become powerful, independent military and political entities, a state within a state, often allying with Nobunaga's rivals. When the monks refused to submit, Nobunaga acted with genocidal fury. In 1571, he surrounded the Enryakuji complex on Mount Hiei, and, in a campaign of terrifying efficiency, burned every single building to the ground and systematically slaughtered every person inside, men, women, and children. This leads us to our quirky or fringe tidbit. The deliberate massacre on Mount Hiei wasn't just about eliminating a military threat, it was a psychological operation. The monks had enjoyed a long-standing reputation of spiritual immunity and divine protection, and they often used the threat of their Sohei, warrior monks, and spiritual curses to intimidate opponents. Nobunaga's calculated total slaughter of the religious community was a statement that not even the gods could protect those who opposed him. He was murdering not just people, but the ancient concept of spiritual authority, proving that his secular military power was supreme. Nobunaga's approach to eliminating personal threats was equally direct. He did not trust in loyalty. He trusted only in demonstrated utility and fear. He frequently used his younger retainers to eliminate older established rivals who showed too much independence. And when his own family became a problem, he dealt with them ruthlessly. His eldest son, Oda Nobutada, was his designated heir and competent commander. However, his second son, Oda Nobukatsu, and his uncle, Oda Nobukane, both caused him political trouble. While he didn't always kill them outright, he routinely executed their chief retainers and humiliated them publicly, ensuring their compliance through sheer terror. His most complex and ultimately fatal family purge involved his retainer Shibata Katsuie and his sister Oichi. When his younger brother Oda Nobuyuki rebelled against him, Nobunaga, advised by Katsuie, initially forgave him, but when Nobuyuki attempted a second coup, Nobunaga had him assassinated. This demonstrated a key principle. He would forgive a political failure once, but a repeat offence meant certain, swift, and secret death. Historians still argue whether Oda Nobunaga's systematic brutality and his massacres, such as the one at Mount Hiei, were purely the result of a megalomaniacal personality, or if that level of terror was the only effective means to shatter the entrenched, chaotic feudal system of the Sengoku era and establish the stable, centralized state that Japan desperately needed. Was he a necessary monster, or simply a monster? The debate often reflects the tension between political efficacy and moral reckoning in historical judgment. Nobunaga also adopted and refined the use of the matchlock rifle, Teppo, which was a huge enabler of large-scale murder. His famous victory at the Battle of Nagashino, 1575, where his lines of massed arquebusiers decimated the famed Takeda cavalry, showed that disciplined firepower, not the romantic ideals of single combat, was the future of warfare and consequently mass execution. He mechanized murder, making it impersonal and industrial. The ultimate consequence of Nobunaga's tenure was that murder became a necessary prelude to order. He didn't just win battles, he purged entire regions of opposition, extinguishing bloodlines that had resisted him for decades. You feel the cold, hard logic of his rule, absolute submission or absolute annihilation. The scattered, petty murders of the daimyo period were coalescing into a terrifying, unified system of state-building through terror. And yet, for a man who mastered the art of eliminating others, his own end would prove the final, most devastating lesson of the Gekkokujo era. No one, not even the man who holds the fate of Japan in his hands, is truly safe from the assassin's betrayal. You left Oda Nobunaga as the master of terror, the brutal unifier who believed he was untouchable after eliminating countless rivals, religious orders, and even family members. But the very system he perfected, the Gekkokujo principle of betrayal and murder, was about to claim its most spectacular victim. This is the moment when the entire trajectory of Japanese history hinged on a single, sudden act of assassination. The betrayal at Honnoji Temple in 1582. You're standing in the middle of Kyoto just before dawn on a stifling summer night. Nobunaga, arrogant and completely confident, is resting at the small, unguarded Honnoji Temple. He is accompanied by only a few dozen pages and guards, having sent his main army, under the command of his most trusted general, Akechi Mitsuhide, to support a campaign in the west. This confidence, born of years of unchallenged dominance, was his fatal flaw. He believed that his fear-fueled system of command had made betrayal impossible. He was wrong. The mainstream historical fact here is the Honnoji incident on June 21st, 1582, when Akechi Mitsuhide suddenly turned his army back toward Kyoto and attacked the temple where Nobunaga was lodged. Mitsuhide's motives remain the core of the mystery, but the result was devastating. Nobunaga was completely trapped, his small retinue quickly overwhelmed. The attack was a massive, coordinated political murder. As the flames consumed the temple, Nobunaga realized the depth of the betrayal. Legend, supported by many historical accounts, suggests that he did not fall in combat, but retreated into the burning structure and committed seppuku, ritual suicide, to avoid the dishonor of being captured or killed by his own subordinate. His body was never found, a crucial detail that only amplified the chaos that followed. Nobunaga's designated heir, Oda Nobutada, who was nearby at Nio Palace, quickly rushed to aid his father, but was cornered by Akechi forces and also forced to commit suicide, ensuring that Akechi's murder plot successfully eliminated the two most important figures of the Oda regime. The most intense part of the historical debate we must explore is the motive. Historians still argue whether Akechi Mitsuhide's betrayal was a calculated act of personal ambition, a sudden, emotional outburst due to repeated humiliations by Nobunaga, or if he was secretly acting under the direction of a powerful third party such as Toyotomi Hideyoshi or Tokugawa Ieyasu. Nobunaga was famous for publicly insulting and physically abusing his subordinates. Did he push Mitsuhide too far, finally snapping the chain of loyalty? Or was Mitsuhide a pawn, his ambition exploited by a rival warlord who saw a golden opportunity? The lack of any clear surviving document from Mitsuhide explaining his why has made his motive the single greatest historical murder mystery in Japan. For the quirky or fringe tidbit, consider the bizarre timing and execution. Mitsuhide was Nobunaga's tea master, a deeply trusted position that often implied a bond of aesthetic and political intimacy, reflecting the old Heian court's use of the ceremony. Remember the poisoned cups. The betrayal of the tea master, a man who shared the most intimate of cultural rituals with his lord, was a symbolic murder as well. The very fact that Nobunaga, the great killer, felt safe enough to rest with a minimal guard in a temple, an environment associated with piety and peace, which he himself had proven was defenceless, is a staggering testament to the power of his self-deception. He trusted in the fear he inspired, but fear, as it turns out, is the fastest route to betrayal. Mitsuhide's murder of Nobunaga, however, proved to be an act of spectacular short-sightedness. He had eliminated the ruler, but had no plan for seizing the entire realm. He failed to secure Nobunaga's surviving family members or his other powerful generals. His reign as the new dominant power lasted a mere 13 days. Hashiba Hideyoshi, later Toyotomi Hideyoshi, another of Nobunaga's top generals, was campaigning far away when he received the news. He immediately concluded a quick, temporary truce with his current enemies, executed a legendary forced march known as the Great Chugoku Retreat, and raced back to Kyoto. Hideyoshi was not just seeking vengeance, he was ruthlessly capitalizing on the murder. Mitsuhide, unable to gain the widespread support of other daimyo, who viewed his act as the ultimate unforgivable betrayal, the Gekkokujo without subsequent success, was swiftly defeated by Hideyoshi at the Battle of Yamazaki. Mitsuhide was killed by peasant bandits or remaining Nobunaga loyalists while fleeing the battlefield, dying not a great warlord, but a desperate fugitive. The ultimate killer was himself ultimately and quickly killed, a perfect demonstration of the volatile nature of murder in the Sengoku era. The murder of Nobunaga at Honnoji was the single most destabilizing act of the entire Warring States period. It threw the process of national unification into a violent competition among Nobunaga's surviving vassals. Hideyoshi, by quickly avenging his lord, managed to position himself as the legitimate heir to Nobunaga's legacy, essentially using the murder as the foundation for his own rise to power. The tragedy of Nobunaga was that he was killed not by an external enemy, but by the very culture of disposable loyalty he had fostered, proving that in a world built on betrayal, even the master murderer cannot escape the knife. You watch the flames die down over Honnoji, knowing that the real political contest has just begun. The smoke has cleared from Honnoji, and the killer, Akechi Mitsuhide, has been swiftly eliminated. You're now witnessing the ascension of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the new master of Japan, a man who learned every lesson about murder and betrayal from his fallen lord, Oda Nobunaga, but applied them with far greater subtlety and bureaucratic efficiency. Where Nobunaga was a public brute, Hideyoshi was a silent, calculating political architect. His purges were less about spectacle and more about meticulous, deniable political murder. Hideyoshi, a man of humble birth who rose solely through competence and sheer ambition, had two overarching goals: to complete the unification of Japan and, crucially, to ensure that his own family line would inherit his immense power. This latter goal required a systematic, silent elimination of all potential threats, especially those who held direct lineage to the man he replaced. The first targets were the remaining powerful generals who served under Nobunaga, known collectively as the Oda retainers. Hideyoshi skillfully manoeuvred to sideline and destroy them, not through frontal assault, but through political isolation and provoked conflict. The mainstream historical fact is the Battle of Shizugatake, 1583, where Hideyoshi deliberately provoked a war with the most powerful remaining Oda loyalist, Shibata Katsui. Remember his relationship with Nobunaga's sister Oichi. Hideyoshi defeated Katsui, who then famously committed seppuku along with Oichi, effectively wiping out a massive segment of Nobunaga's direct military legacy. This was a murder by war, an orchestrated conflict designed purely to eliminate political rivals and seize control of their assets. Once Hideyoshi had eliminated external rivals, he turned with cold calculation to the internal problem of his own succession. He had no sons until late in life, and in 1591 he had named his nephew and heir Toyotomi Hidetsugu as his designated successor, or Kanpaku, imperial regent. Hidetsugu was an ambitious and capable military commander, but when Hideyoshi miraculously had a biological son, Hideyori, in 1593, Hidetsugu immediately became an intolerable political liability. The rule of Gekkokujo meant Hidetsugu would certainly kill the infant Hideyori to secure his own inheritance. Therefore, Hideyoshi, the ultimate practitioner of preemptive murder, had to act first. The purge of Hidetsugu is our key example of Hideyoshi's silent bureaucratic murder. Our quirky or fringe tidbit is the method of his downfall. Hideyoshi used the power of his centralized state to manufacture a crisis. He publicly accused Hidetsugu of crimes such as tyranny and cruelty, fabricating a narrative of mental instability and unfitness to rule. This smear campaign, managed by Hideyoshi's network of administrators and spies, Metsuke, isolated Hidetsugu politically and morally. This was the murder of a reputation before the murder of a person. Cornered and utterly disgraced, Hidetsugu was eventually compelled to commit seppuku on Mount Koya in 1595. While officially a suicide, the reality was forced political murder, executed by Hideyoshi's direct order. The horror, however, did not stop there. In a chilling act of total extermination designed to prevent any future challenge to the infant Hideyori, Hideyoshi ordered the wholesale execution of Hidetsugu's entire family, his wives, concubines, and children, numbering over 30 people. They were publicly executed in Kyoto, their bodies displayed in a mass grave. This was a systematic purge of an entire branch of his own family, done to ensure the stability of his heir. Historians still argue whether Hideyoshi's decision to execute his entire extended family, including innocent women and children, was a necessary act of statecraft required to prevent the collapse of his newly unified realm after his death, or a reflection of pathological paranoia and unchecked power. The debate focuses on whether this level of total extermination was a political necessity in the Gekkokujo environment, or a horrific moral excess that betrayed his own samurai roots. Hideyoshi also refined the use of the inquisitorial system as a tool of murder. He employed networks of spies and censors who were tasked not just with gathering information, but with identifying and eliminating potential dissenters. The Meske were political assassins with official titles. This system was used not only against rivals, but also against religious groups, particularly the Christians, whom Hideyoshi came to view as a political threat. The crucifixion of the 26 martyrs of Japan in 1597, though ostensibly a religious persecution, was fundamentally a political murder designed to assert state authority and eliminate foreign-backed opposition. Hideyoshi's purges were cold, rational, and effective. He replaced Nobunaga's raw terror with institutional dread, ensuring that the state bureaucracy itself was the killer. You realize that you are standing in a newly unified Japan, but the foundation of that unity is paved with the calculated, quiet murders of those who stood in the way of one man's ultimate ambition. The poisoned cup and the secret knife were back, but now they were stamped with the official seal of the regent. This was centralized murder, and it made the realm terrifyingly stable. You've tracked Toyotomi Hideyoshi's silent bureaucratic purges at home, culminating in the extermination of his own nephew's line. Now, with domestic rivals silenced, Hideyoshi turned his gaze outward, believing that his unified, murderously efficient Japan was ready to conquer the entire Asian continent. This ambition led to the Korean invasions, 1592 to 1598, known in Korea as the Imjin War. This disastrous 7-year campaign exported Japanese murder on an unimaginable scale, moving from targeted political assassination to mass, industrialized slaughter. You're no longer in the neat, controlled environments of Kyoto or Kamakura. You're slogging through the devastated Korean peninsula, witnessing an unprecedented level of brutality. Hideyoshi's initial goal was the conquest of Korea as a stepping stone to China. The massive Japanese armies, composed of hardened daimyo and their samurai, fresh from decades of bloody civil war, were ruthlessly effective in the initial phases, sweeping across the peninsula and capturing Seoul. The mainstream historical fact here is the sheer military scale and brutality of the Korean invasions, which represented the largest deployment of Japanese forces in history up to that point. The invasion was characterized by immense cruelty against the civilian population, driven by a need to terrorize the populace into submission and supply the huge occupying armies. The Japanese armies, trained in the Gekkokujo mentality, had a severely devalued view of non-samurai life, a view that they applied with horrifying totality in Korea. The murder during the Korean invasions was multifaceted. First, there was the battlefield slaughter, massive and often one-sided. Second, there was the systematic execution of prisoners of war and non-combatants, a violation of any semblance of ethical conduct. But the most disturbing aspect, and our quirky or fringe tidbit, was the official policy of collecting trophies of murder. Japanese commanders were required to collect the severed noses and ears of their enemies, soldiers and civilians alike, as proof of their kills and to receive rewards from Hideyoshi. These gruesome trophies were packed in salt and shipped back to Japan, where they were interred in a massive mound in Kyoto near the Hokoku Shrine, known as the Mimizuka, ear mound. This practice turned murder into a bureaucratic function of the military machine. A samurai's worth in the campaign was literally measured by the number of severed noses he could present. This system ensured that commanders focused on maximizing the body count, rather than achieving strategic objectives or maintaining discipline. It was the institutionalization of murder as a state-mandated metric of success, and it led to the indiscriminate killing of non-combatants who were easier targets than well-armed soldiers. The Mimizuka stands to this day as a chilling monument to the mass murder committed under the guise of military conquest. The invasion also brought about murder fueled by desertion and lack of supply. Japanese armies were notoriously difficult to supply, especially during the long, drawn-out stalemate after the initial advance. Short on food, the armies often resorted to pillaging and starvation tactics, which resulted in the murder of countless Korean peasants for their meagre food stores. Furthermore, the harsh conditions and continuous fighting led to widespread illness and desertion among the Japanese troops. Retainers who deserted or were caught showing cowardice were swiftly and brutally executed by their own commanders to maintain discipline, a form of internal military murder that kept the remaining troops in line through fear. Historians still argue whether Hideyoshi's decision to launch the Korean invasions was a rational political calculation, to unify the daimyo under a common external cause and prevent them from fighting among themselves, or an act of pure megalomania born from his unprecedented rise to power. Did he export murder to save Japan from internal collapse, or was he simply a killer whose ambition had finally outgrown the island nation? The debate highlights the thin line between political necessity and destructive hubris in the actions of the unifier. Despite the military successes, the campaign ultimately failed due to Korean and Ming Chinese resistance, brilliant Korean naval tactics, led by Admiral Yi Sun-sin, and the sheer logistical impossibility of the enterprise. The campaign ended abruptly with Hideyoshi's death in 1598. The surviving Japanese armies were quickly withdrawn, leaving behind a scarred peninsula and a legacy of deep, murderous resentment. The most critical political consequence of this mass murder abroad was the destabilization it caused at home. The long, expensive war exhausted the Toyotomi treasury, and more importantly created a deep schism among the daimyo. Some great lords, like Tokugawa Ieyasu, had managed to stay out of the conflict, conserving their strength and wealth. Others, who had spent years fighting and murdering in Korea, returned to Japan weakened and resentful. Hideyoshi, the man who had perfected the art of the silent purge, died leaving behind a power vacuum and a 5-member council of regents to govern in the name of his young heir, Hideyori. The men on that council, particularly the well-rested and immensely wealthy Ieyasu, were simply waiting for the right moment to perform the ultimate political murder, the elimination of the Toyotomi dynasty itself. The mass murders in Korea had, ironically, weakened the very structure Hideyoshi had built, setting the stage for the final, deadly act of the unification period. You leave the bloody fields of Korea and return to a Japan that is on the verge of its final, decisive civil war. A conflict that will be settled by the most patient and calculating killer of all. You stand in a Japan exhausted by the Korean invasions and grieving the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The stage is set for the final act of the Sengoku drama, and the last great killer is stepping into the spotlight, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu didn't possess the fire of Nobunaga, or the rapid ambition of Hideyoshi. His murder was strategic, patient, and based on the ultimate principle of survival. Let your enemies destroy themselves, and then clean up the remaining pieces. He was a master of political longevity, outliving and outmaneuvering his foes. Ieyasu had learned every lesson from the previous 3 centuries of political murder. He watched the Ashikaga fratricide, Nobunaga's explosive betrayals, and Hideyoshi's silent purges. He knew that open, messy murder invited chaos and vengeance, and that sudden, rapid moves bred suspicion. His method was to allow his rivals enough rope to hang themselves, while he quietly amassed an unassailable financial and military advantage. You're watching a killer who prefers to wait decades for the perfect moment. The immediate mainstream historical fact here is the power struggle following Hideyoshi's death, which led directly to the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. Hideyoshi had entrusted the governance of his young heir, Hideyori, to the Council of 5 Regents and the Council of 5 Elders. Ieyasu, as the most powerful member of these councils and the only one who had wisely conserved his strength during the Korean invasions, immediately began to violate the solemn oaths he had sworn to protect the Toyotomi heir. He made alliances, built castles, and effectively turned the other regents against each other. The other regents and elders, led by the fiercely loyal Ishida Mitsunari, saw Ieyasu's moves as a transparent attempt at usurpation. They tried to stop him, but Ieyasu had already mastered the ultimate form of political murder, the systematic, subtle corruption of his opponent's retainers. He used wealth, promises of land, and political favours to create deep divisions in the anti-Ieyasu coalition. The battlefield of Sekigahara was less a fair fight, and more a culmination of years of targeted political subversion. The victory at Sekigahara was secured not by Ieyasu's superior fighting, but by the pivotal and prearranged betrayals of key generals on the opposing side, most famously Kobayakawa Hideaki. Ieyasu had secretly negotiated with these generals for weeks, offering them immunity and rewards if they switched sides at the critical moment. This was murder by proxy, where Ieyasu orchestrated the downfall of his enemies using the ambition and treachery of their own allies. The battle itself was the final total purge of the anti-Tokugawa faction. Ishida Mitsunari and the other leading figures of the defeated side were captured and publicly executed, their deaths serving as a definitive bloody punctuation mark on the Sengoku period. The quirky or fringe tidbit concerning Ieyasu's mastery of murder is his profound attention to succession management and the use of forced retirement. Ieyasu made a show of retiring from the shogunal office just 2 years after officially taking it in 1603, handing the title to his son Hidetada. This was a calculated move. It demonstrated that the shogunate was a permanent hereditary institution, unlike the temporary single-generation rules of Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, and, crucially, it allowed Ieyasu to operate from the shadows as the Ogosho, retired shogun. He could then eliminate rivals and make high-stakes, ruthless decisions without staining the reputation of the actual shogun. He perfected the art of committing the necessary murders while enjoying total deniability, preserving his official image as the benevolent aging statesman. He was, effectively, an assassin operating under the cloak of retirement. Historians still argue whether Tokugawa Ieyasu's unparalleled patience and conservative political strategy were purely a reflection of his cautious, long-term personality, or if they were the only possible means to survive the age of Gekkokujo, a strategy adopted only after he witnessed the quick, violent ends of the more impulsive Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. Was his success based on personal virtue, patience, or pragmatic necessity, avoiding the deadly spotlight? The debate points to Ieyasu as the ultimate political scientist of murder, understanding that speed kills the killer as often as the victim. After Sekigahara, Ieyasu spent the next decade systematically dismantling the domains of the surviving daimyo who had fought against him, a slow, legalistic murder of their political and financial power. He would seize land, move their domains to less profitable regions, and force them to undertake massive, costly public works, slowly bleeding them dry. These were not quick assassinations. They were slow, economic deaths orchestrated by the new central government. However, one last massive threat remained, a standing insult to the new order and a focus for all anti-Tokugawa resentment. The surviving Toyotomi family, led by the late Hideyoshi's son Hideyori, who remained in their magnificent castle in Osaka. Ieyasu knew that as long as Hideyori lived, the peace he craved was impossible. The final, spectacular act of murder was approaching. Ieyasu had patiently waited for the right moment, for the political justification and for the necessary strength to eliminate the last legitimate challenge to his rule. You watch as the patient assassin, having successfully eliminated all rivals through politics, betrayal, and engineered conflict, prepares to strike at the very symbol of the old, murdered regime. The final purge will not be subtle, but total and absolute, designed to permanently end the cycle of murder and betrayal by leaving no Toyotomi blood to inspire future vengeance. You've tracked the patient killer, Tokugawa Ieyasu, through decades of calculated waiting and strategic elimination. All the regional rivals have been purged, the daimyo are either crushed or cowed, and the old system lies in ruins. But there remains one glaring living symbol of the past, Toyotomi Hideyori, the son of the great unifier, residing in the massive, powerful Osaka castle, the last bastion of the Toyotomi line. Ieyasu knew the peace he fought for, the lasting stability of the Tokugawa shogunate, could not be secured until the last embers of the Toyotomi name were extinguished. This final act was not a political maneuver, it was a total, absolute, and unforgiving mass murder. You're now watching the meticulous construction of a political pretext for war, a process that took Ieyasu over a decade. Hideyori was now a young man, a source of hope for every disgruntled ronin, masterless samurai, and defeated daimyo. Ieyasu, acting as the retired shogun, Ogosho, patiently monitored Osaka, waiting for a plausible excuse to attack. The mainstream historical fact that triggered the final conflict was the Hokoji Bell inscription incident in 1614. Hideyori's faction had rebuilt a great temple in Kyoto and commissioned a massive bell. Ieyasu's agents, displaying astonishing political paranoia, seized upon the inscription on the bell. They claimed the characters, when read in isolation, contained a curse aimed at Ieyasu and his dynasty, specifically focusing on the phrase Koka Anko, meaning peace and tranquility for the country, which they argued split Ieyasu's name, Ian Yasu, and cursed him. This was a ridiculous trumped-up charge, a blatant fabrication of treason, but it was the perfect legalistic murder weapon Ieyasu needed. When Hideyori's mother, the formidable Yodo Dono, Hideyoshi's former mistress, attempted to send envoys to apologize, Ieyasu imposed humiliating and unacceptable demands, including the demolition of Osaka Castle's massive outer defences and the exile of Hideyori. When the Toyotomi party refused, Ieyasu had his pretext. The ensuing campaigns are known as the Sieges of Osaka, the winter campaign of 1614 and the summer campaign of 1615. The winter campaign was a massive, protracted siege of the nigh impenetrable Osaka Castle. Ieyasu utilised a quirky or fringe tidbit of military murder, the use of relentless psychological cannon fire. He employed European-style cannons not just to destroy the walls, but specifically to target the inner court, particularly Yodo Dono's quarters. This terrifying barrage, meant to undermine the morale of the defenders, was ultimately successful. The Toyotomi forces, despite being well supplied and commanded, were unnerved by the constant shelling. This led to a negotiated truce, where the Toyotomi agreed to dismantle the outer defences, a crippling political blunder. Ieyasu's engineers, displaying typical Tokugawa pragmatism, demolished the defences far beyond the terms of the agreement, effectively neutralising the castle's defences. The truce was merely a pause for Ieyasu to prepare the final act. When the Toyotomi forces attempted to rebuild the defences, Ieyasu denounced them for breaking the truce and launched the devastating summer campaign in 1615. This was not a siege, it was an execution. The fighting was brief and horrific. The weakened Toyotomi armies, desperate and outnumbered, were utterly routed. Osaka Castle was set ablaze. What followed was the absolute, total and final elimination of the Toyotomi line. Hideyori and Yodo Dono, trapped in the burning fortress, committed suicide, as did most of their loyal retainers. Crucially, Ieyasu's forces ensured there were no survivors who could carry the bloodline. Hideyori's infant son, the last male heir, was hunted down, captured and executed by beheading, despite the pleas of his female attendants. This act was the ultimate political murder, designed not just to kill a rival, but to permanently extinguish a dynasty. Ieyasu understood that the only way to end the cycle of Gekkokujo was to remove the target of all future rebellions. Historians still argue whether Ieyasu's actions in the Osaka sieges, from the fabricated curse on the bell to the execution of an infant heir, were an act of unforgivable cruelty, or the necessary, final, bloody chapter required to establish 2.5 centuries of peace, the Pax Tokugawa. Could the Tokugawa shogunate have survived if Hideyori had been allowed to live in exile, or would he always have been a magnet for conflict? The debate weighs the cost of total political murder against the value of sustained national stability. With the Toyotomi bloodline wiped out, the long chaotic era of constant high-stakes political murder effectively ended. The killers, the court poisoners, the rival warlords, the treacherous retainers, were replaced by the ultimate killer, the Tokugawa shogunate, which now held a monopoly on legitimate violence. The subsequent regime would still practice murder, of course, but it would be controlled, institutionalized, and used not to seize power, but to maintain it. The final spectacular act of the Sengoku period was a necessary state-sanctioned crime that paved the way for stability. You stand in the ruins of Osaka, watching the smoke rise, and you know the landscape of murder in Japan has changed forever. The age of the assassin is over. The age of the executioner is beginning. You've stood in the ruins of Osaka Castle, the final fiery curtain call on the age of open, grand-scale political murder. With the Toyotomi line extinguished, the Tokugawa shogunate now holds the keys to 2.5 centuries of enforced peace, known as the Edo period, 1603 to 1868. You might imagine the era to be free of murder, but that would be dangerously naive. Instead, murder became utterly centralised, professionalised, and focused on maintaining the status quo. It moved from the battlefield to the state's internal security apparatus. The most crucial mainstream historical fact of the Edo period is the strict implementation of the Bakuhan system, the centralized military government, bakufu, of the shogun, governing through the regional feudal domains, and of the daimyo. This system was maintained by a policy of total control and constant surveillance, which required a persistent undercurrent of state-sanctioned violence and political murder. The biggest change is that murder was now a crime only when committed against the state's order. When committed by the state, it was justice. You are now watching the rise of the ultimate state-sanctioned killer, the Metsuke censors and the Ometsuke great censors. These officials were the shogunate's internal secret police, tasked with monitoring every aspect of the ruling class. Their primary function was to ensure the daimyo were not plotting rebellion, the shogunate officials were not corrupt, and that the emperor in Kyoto was staying safely in his ceremonial cage. The Metsuke and their vast network of spies, on Mitsu, were the eyes and ears of Edo, and they were empowered to eliminate threats quietly. This leads us to our quirky or fringe tidbit. The Metsuke often orchestrated the political murder of officials or daimyo by enforcing the custom of kaikin or kaeki, confiscation of a domain and dissolution of a clan. If a daimyo was deemed disloyal, financially inept, or even just too popular, the shogunate would bring charges of mismanagement, stripping the lord of his domain. The shogunate rarely executed the daimyo himself, as that caused too much drama. Instead, the disgraced lord was exiled and his retainers were made ronin, masterless samurai. The resulting upheaval, poverty and shame often led the daimyo to commit seppuku voluntarily or be quietly disposed of in exile. This was a clean, paperwork-based murder that avoided the mess of an execution in Edo. The Edo period also saw the constant problem of the ronin, those masterless samurai created by the confiscation of domains. These men, skilled in warfare and often bitter, were a potential source of rebellion, and they were ruthlessly managed by the shogunate's security forces. Sometimes, however, the shogunate or the daimyo themselves would employ these masterless warriors for high-risk, deniable assassinations. These ronin would be paid handsomely for a single, quiet job, say, the murder of a troublesome scholar or a reformist official, and then often killed themselves immediately after the task was complete to ensure secrecy. Their anonymity made the murder untraceable to the powerful patron. Historians still argue whether the extreme isolationist policy, sakoku, enforced during the Edo period was primarily a political measure to stop the threat of European military intervention and Christian infiltration, which could destabilize the shogunate, or if it was an internal economic strategy to consolidate the Tokugawa's control over resources and trade. The debate is essentially about whether the murder of external contact was driven by geopolitical fear or purely internal political ambition to eliminate any external influence that could sponsor an internal plot. The Metsuke system created a terrifying atmosphere of total surveillance. You're walking through the back streets of Edo, knowing that the humble tofu seller or the travelling monk you just passed could be a spy reporting directly to the shogunate. This environment led to the self-censorship of political thought, which was perhaps the most effective, pervasive kind of murder of all, the murder of intellectual and political freedom. A dissenting thought was enough to bring the censor's agents to your door. Perhaps the most famous individual assassination plot of the Edo period was the Akko incident, which, while romanticized as the story of the 47 Ronin, was fundamentally a murder followed by an act of spectacular, albeit controlled, revenge. The initial act was the fatal wounding of a daimyo, Asano Naganori, against the shogunal official Kira Yoshinaka. The resulting revenge murder of Kira by Asano's former retainers forced the shogunate into a terrible bind. They could not allow the murder to go unpunished, but they also could not risk offending the entire samurai class who saw the ronin as honourable. The compromise was a political assassination by decree. All 47 ronin were ordered to commit seppuku, a clean state-sanctioned execution that honoured their loyalty while satisfying the law. It was a masterpiece of control, a mass murder disguised as honourable suicide. The murders of the Edo period were less frequent, more discreet, and almost always performed by, or on behalf of, the state. The shogunate, having achieved ultimate power through generations of murder, made sure that only the shogunate could now commit murder with impunity. The era of the bold assassin was replaced by the age of the bureaucratically authorized killer, a subtle but far more pervasive kind of political violence. You've witnessed how the Tokugawa shogunate monopolized political murder, turning it into a tool of state maintenance. Now we must turn to the ultimate expression of that monopoly, the official state-sanctioned executioner and the grim realities of the culture of death in the Edo period. For 2.5 centuries of peace, the threat of official punishment, the ultimate public murder, was the silent partner to the Metsuke's surveillance. The executioner was not a rogue assassin, but an indispensable agent of order. The mainstream historical fact here is the 5 punishments, Gokei, the codified system of state-sanctioned murder and corporal punishment used throughout the Edo period. These punishments ranged from simple beating and shaving one's head to the various forms of capital punishment. This system was designed not for reform, but for absolute deterrence, making the act of state murder a highly visible, terrifying public spectacle. The final purpose was always to enforce the rigid social hierarchy, known as the shinokosho, samurai, farmer, artisan, merchant, a structure that was literally backed by the executioner's sword. The highest forms of capital punishment included decapitation, kubigiri, by the sword, and crucifixion, haritsuke, usually reserved for arson, highway robbery, and particularly heinous crimes. The most brutal was burning, hiaburi, reserved for extremely serious crimes like murder within the same family or serial arson in the crowded wooden cities. These executions were deliberately public, taking place at designated sites, most famously the Suzugamori execution grounds in Edo and the Rokujogawara in Kyoto. You can imagine the scene: large crowds, the final agonizing moment, the display of the severed head, all calculated to instill fear and obedience into the populace. The role of the executioner itself is a morbidly fascinating quirky or fringe tidbit. In Edo society, the task of official execution and testing swords was often performed by the Yamada clan, hereditary executioners. They were part of the hinin non-people class, pushed to the very bottom of the social ladder due to the spiritual impurity associated with blood and death. Yet, they held a unique, necessary function for the ruling class. The most famous line of these executioners, the Yamada Asaiman, a professional name, not a personal one, became known as Kubigiri Asaemon, Decapitator Asaemon, and were highly skilled swordsmen. Their role often included testing the quality and sharpness of a daimyo's prized katana by using the blade to decapitate a condemned criminal. The executioner, a social pariah, was nonetheless a master craftsman whose skill was essential to the samurai's honour. This dual position, essential yet despised, highlights the hypocrisy of the Edo period's moral code. The samurai warrior code prized honour and purity, yet depended absolutely on the work of the hinin class to handle the dirty, bloody work of state-mandated murder. The executioner stood at the nexus of power and impurity, a living paradox of the society. The practice of honourable suicide, seppuku, which we've mentioned before, was another form of state-sanctioned murder, albeit one cloaked in ritual dignity. When a samurai was sentenced to death for a high crime, he was often allowed to commit seppuku, which preserved his honour and his family's name, preventing the confiscation of his land. However, this was rarely a private, voluntary act. The state would send an official to supervise, and an attendant, kaishakunin, was present to perform the immediate mercy-killing decapitation, as the condemned made the symbolic cut. The entire ritual was a tightly controlled, meticulously documented form of state murder that simply allowed the victim to choose the style of his death. The ultimate power remained with the shogunate to grant or deny this honourable final act. Historians still argue whether the seppuku ritual, for all its brutality, genuinely provided a form of spiritual or social redemption for the condemned samurai, or if it was simply a cynical, ingenious method employed by the shogunate to enforce compliance and eliminate troublesome individuals without creating martyrs or provoking revenge from their families. Did the samurai choose an honourable death, or were they politically compelled into a state-approved form of suicide? The debate lies in the complex intersection of honour, political necessity, and forced murder. The culture of death pervaded the entire legal system. Interrogation under the shogunate often involved torture to extract confessions, which meant that the death sentence was often confirmed by a confession elicited under duress. The legal process was primarily designed to confirm the guilt already assumed by the censors and administrators, making the entire journey from accusation to the execution grounds a seamless path to state-ordered murder. You leave the execution grounds with a clear understanding. In the Edo period, the shogunate did not just stop unauthorized murder, it assumed the role of the ultimate legitimate killer. The fear that had once been generated by the hidden shinobi or the chaotic daimyo was now channeled into one single overwhelming source of state power. This was a centralized terror, and the Kubigiri Asaemon was merely the man holding the sword at the end of the line. The peace of the Tokugawa era was therefore bought and maintained by the constant visible threat of the executioner's blade. You have journeyed from the poisoned courts of the Heian aristocracy to the bloody siege of Osaka, and finally through the chilling, controlled terror of the Edo execution grounds. The entire landscape of medieval Japanese history is drenched in the calculated political murder of rivals, families, and entire social systems. Now, as the lights of the Edo period dim and the modern era dawns, you must consider the final question. How did this centuries-long culture of political murder and institutionalized death shape the Japanese nation and its memory? The most immediate mainstream historical fact here is the Meiji Restoration, 1868, which overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate and restored the emperor to political power. This transition was itself a final spasm of political violence. While often romanticized as a bloodless revolution, the Boshin War that accompanied it involved significant fighting and targeted assassinations. The old killers, the Metsuke and the executioners, were replaced by a new generation of political assassins who saw murder as the necessary catalyst for modernization. Key figures on the shogunate's side were killed, and the entire Tokugawa structure, built over 260 years, was politically murdered and replaced by a new imperial government. The cycle, though dramatically altered, had not entirely stopped. The target simply shifted from a shogun to the shogun's authority itself. The legacy of the murderers in modern Japan can be traced through several enduring cultural and institutional remnants. The most profound is the emphasis on loyalty to the state above all else, a direct inheritance from the warrior code that was refined in the chaos of the Sengoku period. The Gekkokujo principle taught every lord and retainer that betrayal was a valid tool for success, but the ultimate success of the Tokugawa era taught that absolute, unswerving loyalty to the supreme authority was the only way to survive long-term. This extreme focus on hierarchy and top-down authority, even to the point of self-sacrifice, is a cultural memory forged in the fear of the shogunate's swift, comprehensive retaliation against disloyalty. The quirky or fringe tidbit that demonstrates this enduring legacy lies in the modern perception of the assassin. Figures like Akechi Mitsuhide, who murdered Nobunaga, and the various shinobi are not simply remembered as villains. They are often viewed as tragic, complicated figures, or even necessary actors who made difficult choices. Mitsuhide, despite his disastrous attempt at usurpation, is often framed as a loyalist to an older moral order, forced to kill a tyrannical lord who had lost his way. This cultural ambiguity, where the murderer is given historical sympathy, shows a deep psychological wrestling with the violence that built the nation. The popular acceptance of the assassin as a morally complex figure, rather than just a criminal, is a direct inheritance of the political murders that defined the medieval era. The structure of the modern Japanese state also retains echoes of the systems of murder we discussed. The police apparatus and the highly centralized bureaucracy owe a debt to the efficiency and pervasive reach of the Tokugawa Metsuke. While no longer sanctioned to kill rivals, the institutional surveillance and control of dissent are a legacy of the Edo state, which was built on the constant monitoring and subtle elimination of potential threats. The peace of the Edo period required an iron fist, and the framework of that fist remained after the fist was supposedly opened. Historians still argue whether the extreme emphasis on consensus and unanimity in modern Japanese decision-making, the intense social pressure to avoid open dissent and public conflict, is a cultural trait that predates the samurai era, or if it is a psychological defense mechanism developed in response to the centuries of political murder and violent betrayal. Was the fear of poisoning, assassination, and public execution so pervasive that the culture developed an almost absolute allergy to open conflict, preferring to resolve issues through subtle negotiation, behind-the-scenes manoeuvring, and the avoidance of any action that could be construed as disloyal or rebellious? The debate centres on whether the modern polite facade is innate or a learned behaviour against historical terror. Even the aestheticization of violence remains. The samurai sword, the katana, is revered not merely as a weapon, but as a symbol of the soul of the samurai, its history inextricably linked to the numerous sanctioned decapitations it performed. The enduring popularity of historical dramas that depict seppuku, betrayal, and assassination shows a nation still fascinated and grappling with the ruthless pragmatism that defined its past. The killers of medieval Japan, though dead, live on in the collective memory, the folklore, and the very foundations of the modern political structure. The legacy is one of pragmatism over purity. From the moment the Minamoto purged their own family to the moment Ieyasu killed a child to secure peace, the lesson of medieval Japan was that the political end justified the murderous means. This hardened, non-sentimental approach to power is the final, chilling gift of the murderers to the nation. You can't separate the eventual stability and unity of Japan from the calculated, systematic violence required to achieve it. And with that, our journey through the shadows, courts, and battlefields of medieval Japan must come to an end. The final images of this long journey are fading now. The sounds of distant hooves and the whispered conspiracies of Kyoto are dissolving into the quiet of your room. Let the stories of the ruthless daimyo and the silent assassins drift away, back into the history books where they belong. The intricate plots, the flash of the executioner's blade, the smoke rising from Osaka Castle. All of it is safely behind the veil of time now. You've walked among the murderers, but you are home, safe in the here and now. Feel the weight of that quiet peace. It was purchased at a terrible cost, a history that requires us to understand its darkness to fully appreciate the light we live in today. There are no plots tonight, no poisoned cups, no Shogun censors watching your windows, just the quiet hum of your fan and the soft blanket of rest waiting for you. Let the shadows lengthen and embrace the stillness. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and surrender to the quiet of the present moment. You've earned the rest.